How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast gems.
Why I'm Still a Christian. After 2 decades of conversations with skeptics and atheists, the reason I believe. That's the title of my new book, and it's available now. Read my case for faith after a lifetime hosting debates between atheists and Christians. Find out why God makes sense of human existence, value, and purpose, and learn how to respond to some of the toughest objections to faith. This is a book to inspire confidence in Christians and to help seekers explore the claims of Christian faith. Why I'm Still a Christian is available now at justinbrierley.com, where you can also get exclusive signed copies. Or, when you become a gold level supporter of this show, you'll get a free signed copy of both my books. Click the link with today's show info to buy or to support.
3 big areas of growth: the Orthodox Church, the Pentecostal and Charismatic churches are growing, and then a third area, and that is a lot of migrant churches.
The churches which are growing are the very high church and the very low church. Anybody who does the bells and smells and anybody who does the clapping and the hand waving.
It's the ones that offer something otherworldly. It's the mushy middle that sort of is the place where I think that the churches are declining, actually.
Respectable, institutional, middle of the road, spreadsheet wielding, PowerPoint mongering Christianity is probably toast. I for one will not mourn it.
Hi there, and welcome back to today's show, where I'll be bringing you a panel discussion I was part of in London, hosted by the think tank Theos. I discussed the question, does the future have a church, along with 4 other distinguished panellists. But just before we dive in, a reminder that you can keep up to date with this show by subscribing to my newsletter. I'll even send you the first chapter of both my surprising rebirth book and my new book, Why I'm Still a Christian, when you subscribe to the newsletter. And if you can support this podcast, it does make a huge difference in me being able to record and broadcast events like this one. Monthly silver supporters get early access to new episodes plus bonus content, and gold supporters also get a monthly catch-up with me plus signed copies of both my books. The link for the newsletter and to support this show is with the show notes. Now, many people have made predictions about the future of faith. So what is the future for the church in the UK and the West generally? Well, in an increasingly unstable and dark world, will people return to or at least reconsider belief, or are we continuing to hear that melancholy long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith? Well, that was the question asked at the Theos Annual Lecture, where, as someone who's responsible for both a book and this podcast series on that theme, I was invited to take part in a panel discussion with 4 other guests. Now, it's worth noting that this conversation took place in the wake of the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, following the publication of the Makin Report detailing institutional failings in the Church of England over abuse and safeguarding. So we discussed some of those rather dismal headlines about the national church early on in the conversation. But things do get more optimistic too. It's also worth noting this conversation took place before the Bible Society UK released their much publicised Quiet Revival research, showing a very significant upturn in churchgoing in the UK. So that doesn't get referenced here, but as you'll hear, I and the other panellists do anticipate its findings, especially around the rise in churchgoing in Catholic and Pentecostal spaces. The discussion was chaired by Senior Fellow of Theos, Dr. Nick Spencer. My fellow panellists were Daisy Scalchi, Head of Religion and Ethics for BBC Television, Madeleine Davies, Senior Writer for the Church Times, Mary Harrington, Writer and Author of Feminism Against Progress, and Bishop Mike Royal, General Secretary of Churches Together in England. And by the way, Mike Royal is also one of the guests for our Responding to the Rebirth conference in London on Saturday the 22nd of November this year. Tickets went on sale earlier this month and they are absolutely flying out the door, so don't leave it too late to book in at rebirthconference.net. And I'm really looking forward to co-hosting that conference with Glenn Scrivener. And as you'll hear, lots of the conversation in today's show is very pertinent to the rebirth phenomenon. It was recorded as a live audience event in London, includes a great Q&A from some of those present, and many thanks to Theos for permission to rebroadcast it here. So welcome to episode 15 of our second season of the surprising rebirth of belief in God. Does the future have a church? Here's Nick Spencer introducing the conversation.
So, you just started using LinkedIn Premium. Now what? Well, on your premium company page, you noticed around 7.5 times more page engagement and 5 times more page views. Well done. And now, new clients are messaging you. All because you're using LinkedIn Premium, which helps you get the business growth you want. Think big, small business. Think big. Start your free trial at linkedin.com/premium small business. That's linkedin.com/premium small business.
Thomas Jefferson confidently predicted in 1822, and this was just before the Second Great Awakening, there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. 150 years later, the sociologist Peter Berger, writing in the New York Times, said that by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist the worldwide secular culture. According to the Pew Forum's most recent research, the world is set to become more rather than less religious in the 21st century. In Britain, immigration is revivifying congregations everywhere. Churches across the land are running food banks and warm banks and youth clubs and advice clinics. Many people are showing signs of real and genuine spiritual openness, and in recent years, a bizarre group of very different people have been saying some really remarkably positive things about Christianity in public life. Perhaps there is some truth in what the Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc said 100 years ago, namely that the church is a perpetually defeated thing that always seems to outlive her conquerors. So what's happening? Were we to scroll forward 10 or 50 or 100 years, what would we find? Does the future have a church? To discuss this, I'm joined by 5 people who know whereof they speak when it comes to the presence and role of Christianity in particular and faith in general in contemporary public life. Justin Brierley is a broadcaster, author and speaker, co-host of the Re-Enchanting podcast and the author of the recent book and podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Madeleine Davies is senior writer at the Church Times and also writes The New Statesman. She's the author of Lights Through the Path, a guide through grief, pain and loss. Mary Harrington is a contributing editor at Unheard. She's written for The New Statesman, The Spectator, The Times and The Telegraph, and is also the author of the book Feminism Against Progress. Bishop Mike Royal is the General Secretary of Churches Together in England, the former co-CEO of the Cinnamon Network, and former National Director of the award-winning children's charity Transforming Lives for Good. And Daisy Scalchi is the BBC's Head of Religion and Ethics for Television and has commissioned a wide range of programmes with the aim of reflecting Britain's diverse range of faith and beliefs, including Pilgrimage, Big Zoo Goes to Mecca for BBC Two, and Stacey Dooley Inside the Undertakers, BBC One. Please welcome our panel. There is, I think, only one place we can really begin our conversation, which is in a sense the reason why we're here today. And I want to start with you, Madeleine, to ask you specifically as well from your, as it were, paper of record position, so the Church Times, how much damage do you think the last month or so has done to the Church of England?
So I think it's too early to answer that question. I was quite surprised that there was a poll that YouGov just happened to be doing around the same time that the Macon review about the abuse came out. So this was even prior to people really engaging with that report. And I was quite surprised that more than a third of people had an unfavourable impression of the Church of England. I was quite surprised by that because normally I would agree with a report that the Church of England had a few years ago, which described the public perception as a sort of benign ambivalence. So we tend to assume, I think, that people don't really have strong feelings either way about the Church of England. So I was quite surprised that that was so high, and I would assume that that's probably increased in the wake of recent headlines. I think one challenge for the Church of England is that relatively few people actually have a personal interaction with it. So if you look at something like the NHS, you'll often find that people have a positive personal interaction with it, but will assume that that's unusual and will have a less favourable impression of the institution. I think with sort of fewer than 700,000 people on average going to church every week, there isn't that kind of local interaction that might counterbalance their impression of the national institution. I think it partly depends on sort of what we mean when we talk about the Church of England. Do we mean the bishops in the House of Lords and Justin Welby, or do you mean sort of Reverend Jones, who baptised me, who married us, and fewer people have that personal connection to the church.
The church does have this headline, doesn't it, about a Christian presence in every community, and it also makes the point that even if it has a smaller number of active churchgoers, it has a large number of people who do come into contact with the church, either through schools or occasional offices, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Is your impression that that penumbra is decreasing as well?
Yes, and so the report that I mentioned that referred to this benign ambivalence said the biggest shrinking sort of cohort for the church was that sort of nominal fringe. So that sort of cultural nominal fringe is the bit that's fastest declining.
Justin, is that something you would countersign? Would you add to that?
I have the sense that absolutely the latest headlines and issues that the Macon report has rightly highlighted have been obviously very bad for the Church of England at an institutional level. And there's an awful lot of work that needs to go into putting that right. I get the sense, though, that at a local level, I don't get the sense that many people are choosing not to enter their local Church of England because of those headlines. I sense that people sort of distinguish what's happening at a national level from what's going on in their local parish church. Now, obviously, there's going to be exceptions to that. But rather, I suppose I would liken it to every institution in recent years has sort of had some kind of issue of abuse and scandal to work through. When the BBC had the Jimmy Savile scandal, obviously there was a report and there had to be a lot done to put that right. But I don't think people stopped watching the BBC. It was just that they kind of said, yes, there are problems. And I think people can kind of distinguish, in my view, between what's going on at an institutional level and the people they meet. So I often meet skeptics, atheists who say, I disagree with religion. I don't like what religion has done in the world. They have a view of religion as an institution. But when you ask them, well, what about the people you know who are religious? They generally say, yeah, they're okay, actually. So I suppose I've got some faith in the idea that people can distinguish between their personal experience and these institutional failings.
Mary, you wrote that you suspected that some of those who were calling for the Archbishop of Canterbury's resignation were motivated by factors other than his handling of historic abuse. In your mind, are there other things going on here?
Almost certainly, yes. I mean, I'm a bit loath to weigh too heavily into the internal politics of the Church of England, because that's not really my wheelhouse. But having sort of tracked that kind of from the fringes, my sense is that there's a range of views, we could say, within the Church of England on how best to govern the Church of England. And there are those who feel that power should remain within the parishes, and there are those who supported a more managerial, centralising, sort of vaguely PowerPoint-flavoured approach, and that perhaps Welby was more on that side than the other, and perhaps those who felt more parochially inclined were sort of cheering from the sidelines as an occasion became apparent where their foe could be toppled. And I mean, that's a sort of a hunch as to, one of the other things that's in play there. I mean, if it were the case that was part of what was going on there, I think my hunch is that they won't be pleased by the result of having
having evicted Justin Welby for this reason. Because from what I can make out, it's having purged him for, having found a pretext to purge him, they won't by doing so have got rid of the managerialism, which is the thing they really don't like. Which is, if anything, it's going to be made worse because people will come up with a whole new set of processes and procedures and, officers. And I think about my local churches, and some of them are sort of, they've got 10 superannuated parishioners who've all known each other for 25 years and are all in the same bridge club, and yet they're still bristling with safeguarding officers. And you think, I'm not completely sure I understand what's going on.
Yeah. It may be a slightly artificial segue to managerialism and move to the BBC, Daisy, but I can't resist it, really. I'm really struck by this institution. I've seen data in the past that shows that the church, specifically the Church of England, we're going to widen this out, does suffer from an NHS problem. If you ask people at the NHS, it's in terrible states, long waiting list, dirty hospitals, so on and so forth. You ask the same people about their own personal experience of the NHS, visiting the GP and get an appointment or going to a hospital, tends to be more positive. So there's a problem that the institution has. And the BBC is one of the institutions. So is that kind of criticism, there's something that resonates with you, that this isn't fundamentally actually an institutional problem?
Do you mean specifically in reference to the BBC, or BBC as an example of what's happening with the church?
I think the latter, really.
I suppose, how would that play out if that were the case? You would see people, as you say, deciding not to come to the programmes or protesting by switching off, and that doesn't seem to be happening. Certainly when it comes to the religion output, which is the area I look after, there is as great a demand now as there ever was. I think the real difference is the way we need to respond to those audiences' needs, and to continually ask, what is it that people want and what do they need? What are they asking for in the religion and faith space? And that is more, I think, diverse. It's broader now than it ever has been. So there's a job to do in understanding what that looks like. And I think we've made some good headway into creating programs that do feel quite distinct and are representing the growing, where faith and religion and belief are growing, as you said at the top of your intro. But also it's really important not to forget the huge section of the audience who really want to come to traditional Christian worship. And that is in really rude health, contrary to what you might think from, some of the headlines or some of the other data. During the pandemic, we saw people turning on in huge numbers to religious services who weren't themselves religious and were saying, I just want to come to a place where I feel safe, where I feel I'm in a community, I'm doing something with other people, even if it's from the privacy of my own home. And then after the pandemic, those numbers sloped away again, as you might imagine. But actually this year, we're seeing more people coming back to traditional worship programming. So there is something happening there where there is a need, there is a desire, and that's something we have to respond to.
That's really interesting. Do you have any research amongst, why people are doing that? Is it, as you said, because it's something familiar, something reassuring?
We don't know why, we just know the what, and then the why can come from piecing together all sorts of other data and information about what people are looking for. But I do think there is something in this search, these questions. At the moment, there is so much happening in the world, and we are in a post-pandemic period that I think is still so close to our recent history. We don't have enough distance really to put that in a place where we can really reflect on it as an historic thing. It's still a present tense contemporary history. And I think that has prompted a lot of people to ask big questions about their life, about purpose, about meaning. Where do you derive that from? And if that's not from a traditional faith, and for many of the audience it won't be, where do you seek those answers, or where can you at least see those questions reflected? And I think that's the job that we have to do, is to create that space where those questions and those conversations could be had from a multitude of different perspectives.
That's really helpful, and we will definitely come back to that, because I want to kind of slowly widen the focus of our discussions as we go through, and from the specific problems of the last few weeks to the wider kind of faith landscape. But by means of that, I want to make this point that is so important. There's been no shortage of commentary on the Church of England in the last 3 or 4 weeks or so, but it's very important to stress that the Church of England is not the same as the Church in England, let alone as the Church in Britain. And Mike, I want to bring you here. You're General Secretary of the Churches Together in England. Can you just first tell us about CTE? Because there may be some people in the audience who aren't familiar.
Yeah, so Churches Together in England is the official instrument of the churches to work together in unity. It is actually the broadest ecumenical body in Europe. I've sat with the general secretaries across Europe, and no one has the breadth we do. So we have 54 denominations that relate into Churches Together in England. Obviously the Anglican Communion, the Catholic Bishop Conference of England and Wales, the Free Churches Group, which is quite a substantial grouping, the Lutherans and the Quakers, Pentecostals and the Charismatics, which is the biggest single grouping, and then the Orthodox Church. And I would just say that three big areas of growth is the Orthodox Church. So I believe there's about 3 million Orthodox Christians now in the UK, and many of them are coming from communities that are not post-Christian. Secondly, the Pentecostal and Charismatic churches are growing. Redeemed Christian Church of God plant churches like they're going out of fashion. Unbelievable. And then a third area that's actually beyond our reach, and that is a lot of migrant churches, people who are coming here perhaps to work. Their communities are setting up churches. And so there's an incredible groundswell of these churches in communities. And so it's a really interesting picture when you move away from the historic churches.
That is interesting, isn't it? And also, one can't make the kind of familiar where people are moving away from the institution point there, because the Orthodox is a historic church. The other two are more modern, you're talking about. Are there any kind of patterns? I mean, I guess migration's playing a part in that growth, but is it the driver? Or what else is going on there?
Migration is a huge reason for the growth of the church in some of the areas I've just spoken about, and whether we like it or not, that is going to continue. I think the challenge will come, and certainly it's come with the Caribbean churches. If you move to second and then third and fourth generation, whether there is a change as you go through the generation. So already some of those churches, so some of the Orthodox churches, perhaps who, perhaps have come from Romania, for example, speak and worship in Romanian. Well, their children are growing up in Britain. Do they want to worship in English or Romanian? Because Romanian suddenly is a second language. So it will be interesting to see how they deal with growth or otherwise as the generations begin to grow up.
Can I ask Mike just about that? Because it's so interesting, that difference in the generational approach. Do you find that that's something that people generally can accommodate and grow around, or do you find that it's actually quite difficult and in places it's causing some conflict?
And it doesn't tend to cause conflict, but what you will get is a wandering away. And I mean, some of that has happened with the Caribbean church, who kind of came in the 50s and 60s. And, second generation, I'm second generation Windrush. When you get to third generation or fourth generation, does that generation want to stay in that church, or do they want to wander off to another church? Or do they lose a sense of faith? There's some indication that that's happened. It will be interesting to see what happens with the newer churches that have come in more recently.
Friends, I'm delighted to announce that tickets for our Responding to the Rebirth conference are now on sale at rebirthconference.net. If you've been tracking the surprising rebirth of belief in God, or the news of a quiet revival in the UK, you won't want to miss this day in London on Saturday, the 22nd of November, 2025. I'll be joined by guests including Professor John Lennox, author Paul Kingsnorth, podcaster Elizabeth Oldfield, Bishop Mike Royal, researcher Rhiannon McAleer, and the Reverend Al Gordon as we explore what's happening, why, and what next steps we can take as a new generation returns to faith. I'm so looking forward to co-hosting the day with Glenn Scrivener of Speak Life as we encourage the church to be ready for this turning of the tide. Tickets are going surprisingly fast, so book your seat now at rebirthconference.net.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Something else to throw into the mix when we're talking about which communities are growing and which aren't. And this is drawn from a recent book by a good friend of mine, Rod Dreher, who's an American who's based in Hungary. He's a convert. I think he's a convert twice over, first to Roman Catholicism, and now he's landed in Greek Orthodox Christianity. He's by far the only Greek Orthodox convert that I know personally who's converted in the last few years. And Rod has just this year published a book about the re-enchantment of Christianity on related themes, I think, to your work, Justin. And he talks about the fact that some churches are growing and some aren't. And in his observation, which actually maps down to precisely onto what you're saying, Mike, is that the churches which are growing are the very high church and the very low church. So the charismatics are growing, and the Greek Orthodox and the very high Anglican, and anybody who does the bells and smells, and anybody who does the clapping and the hand waving, they're doing great, and everybody else is they're just dying on there. And his hypothesis, and mine as well actually, is that's happening, and it's following that pattern with the hollowing out in the middle, is because those are the churches where people feel something. It's vibes based, to put. And this is, and because people, I mean, if you just want an experience, you want to go shopping on Sunday, there's no shortage of places you can do that. But if you want to feel the thing, and you don't necessarily know how to put that into words, then you need a form of worship where people do the thing, and aren't embarrassed about it. And honestly, that's at the high church end and it's the low church end. Everybody in the middle is desperately embarrassed.
That's very interesting. Brilliant. It's I'm just trying to work out which category I'd fit into. It's probably not ideal. Madeleine, is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah. I think it's partly related to the intention to grow. So I think when the Church of England has done its own studies, I think the big kind of factor associated with growth is, do you actually intend to grow? Is there a commitment there? And there are some other factors at play, but they tended to suggest that it's not necessarily a question of tradition. It is, what is your intention? Is there a desire for growth? Is there a commitment? And I think that can exist sort of across the wings of the Church of England. I think sort of in recent years, we've seen with sort of charismatic evangelical church planting, there is a clear drive there for evangelism, for planting churches, for going into communities. And so we have seen growth there. But I don't think that's to say that it couldn't exist in other areas.
Interestingly, I've been hearing about this boom in Orthodox church going as well. And not just here, but especially in the USA, there's been a huge number of new people entering Orthodox parishes. And one of the Orthodox priests I was hearing talking about it was saying, what's interesting is we haven't come up with some fancy evangelism program or church planting program. We've just continued to do exactly what we've already done, but people are suddenly just turning up in church. And I think the reason for that is that something's happening in the culture, which is suddenly making people reappraise the value of some kind of traditional worship, especially worship that is actually quite mysterious. And this sort of preempts something we might talk about later, but in a lot of these conversations I've been having with people who are sort of on the edge of church, interested in it, they're looking for weird, they're looking for something that is not normal. And so, to Mary's point, it's the ones that offer something otherworldly, something that takes you out of your humdrum daily existence. They're actually the most attractive, and it's the mushy middle that sort of is the place where I think that the churches are declining, actually. And it can be quite different, the expression of what that weirdness is.
That's really interesting, isn't it? The historian Tom Holland, who gave our annual lecture a few years ago, has done a lot of talking on this subject recently, and I think one of his pieces of advice is the church should lean into the weird. We might kind of probe that, but I want to pick up, Justin, you've written about the surprising rebirth of belief in God, and you ran the Unbelievable podcast for 15 years.
I did, yeah, until I finished up that one.
Now, that was engaging people, talking to one another about a whole range of subjects, but I think it's fair to say these were rational discussions, not rationalist discussions, but they were about thinking through faith as well. Now, I'm not suggesting that approach was wasted in 15 years or so, but what's your view, having done that, having talked to believers and unbelievers about whether this stuff actually makes sense or not, mentally, cognitively, does that still matter so much today?
Well, it's really interesting because when I started that show, Unbelievable, back in 2005, it was very much the heyday of new atheism. Everyone was publishing these anti-God books and going, in the bestseller charts. And so the conversation was very much this sort of whole debate about whether it's rational to be a Christian, whether there's evidence for God. And we had a great time debating that for several years with a lot of those voices. But it was probably in the last 5 to 6 years that I sensed the conversation really change, and people were just either bored of those questions or the new atheism had kind of run out of steam. And suddenly there was the rise of lots of new, interesting people, often still secular people, but asking very different questions and offering very different answers to the new atheist types. And so you had the rise of people like Tom Holland, secular historian, but suddenly talking very different terms about the value of Christianity and the way in which he sees the Christian revolution has reshaped the modern world. You got, people like the psychologist Jordan Peterson suddenly drawing millions of people to his platform and apparently directing them towards the Bible as a source of meaning and purpose and identity and so on. And so by its nature, I sort of tracked where the conversations were going. So by the time that I finished hosting that show about 1.5 years ago, that was really where a lot of the conversations were happening, no longer these very, as you say, rational conversations. Not that they were right for their time, but it felt like the conversation had moved on. And it's what I've kind of termed this surprising rebirth of belief in God, where people are suddenly asking existential questions again, for reasons that I think, were outlined earlier, that the way in which the pandemic and sort of just the uncertainty that we're seeing politically and globally has sort of made people ask, well, what am I here for? Yeah. And I think because that very scientific new atheist sort of approach basically failed to answer those kinds of questions, people have kind of opened up again to the possibility that religion might have something to say to them. And I think increasingly for me, it's what I term in the book a meaning crisis in our culture, that sense that we've lost any coherent story to make sense of our lives, and people are reaching for stories in all sorts of different places, but which aren't ultimately satisfying them. I think that's a lot to do with why there's this drive back towards a form of faith and religion that feels like it has some stability in the story that's been around a bit longer.
Thank you. Mary?
Just a very brief, it's surely part of the reason new atheism has failed so comprehensively is because the world got more secular, but it didn't get any more, the world got a lot more secular, but it didn't get more rational. Quite the opposite.
And stayed just as religious, but
yeah, it stays just as barking mad. It just travels under different guises. We've got the Great Awakening instead, which is arguably no more rational, and has some considerable downsides.
I think that's a really important point about, we find ourselves in current cultural moments, certainly globally and arguably Western Europe, which is just uncertain and more insecure than it was 20 or so years ago. And it seems to me that in those moments, people are more inclined to reach out for, systems is the wrong word, but institutions, that's probably the wrong word too, but ideas and traditions to give them some kind of anchor in this sort of rather choppy seas.
But it's also the internet. It changes the way people think in a way which I think is still very underpriced amongst people who habitually read books, which is probably everybody in this room. I imagine everybody here has extensive bookshelves and reads preferably rather than scrolling. But among people who primarily scroll, they just perceive the world differently. They process information differently, and it tilts. I can't prove this, but I can just tell you from observation, and I've been extremely online for 20 years. The people who scroll primarily, and that's their main means of consuming information, perceive the world through pattern recognition to a very much more considerable degree. And I think if your habitual disposition towards the world comes through pattern recognition, you're just more open to God.
Very interesting, that. Daisy, can I pick up this point about experience and meaning? Is that the kind of thing that you find, when we talk about the traditional Christian broadcasting that appeals to a surprising number of people, does the kind of the search for something experiential, something you feel, and some kind of meaning, does that shape the way in which you make programs, and does that kind of feed what people are interested in your audience?
I'm also going to have to come back to the idea that if you scroll, then we're open to God. Something I'm definitely keen to talk about.
My kid's a living disproof of that.
Well, do you want me to expand on that now?
Maybe I'll respond to Nick, and then definitely I'd like to pick up on that, because that's not something I've heard put forward before. But to meaning and purpose and how we create programs that can respond to that, yes, it does, because I think we have to respond to what we know is changing in the way people choose to worship, to find their faith, to see their faith reflected or not in that broader category of belief, but perhaps not necessarily through a traditional faith, as we've talked about before, and also the word spiritual, which comes up more and more. What do we mean by that? And I think there are lots of different answers to that question, but certainly in that group, you will find people who want to explore these large questions around life, death, meaning, purpose, connection, family, that perhaps historically may have been done more through a traditional faith, or Christianity, certainly here in this country, and now is perhaps less the case. But that desire and that appetite is still there. I think programs like the one you mentioned at the top, Stacey Dooley Inside the Undertakers, actually is quite a good example of trying to respond to that question from audiences who might not traditionally, or certainly now, want to look at those questions through a faith lens. I don't know, for those of you who may not know Stacey Dooley, she's a presenter and broadcaster. She's very good at just connecting with people on any level. And she herself is at a moment that perhaps many of us would recognize, having had a child and started to ask questions, particularly post-pandemic, around what is the world that I'm bringing a child into, and what does that mean? How can I answer questions around death? What does or doesn't happen afterwards when they inevitably come when that child's a bit bigger? I don't really know what I think about that. Death is a scary subject. How do you engage with it? And it's just prompted her to go and explore, where can you have that conversation if it's not in church or with a faith community? So she decided to go and spend a couple of weeks with an undertakers in Nottinghamshire to get up close and personal with people who are dealing with death every day. And it is, as you would imagine, quite enlightening and quite surprising, challenging as well. But two of the stories that we kept in the film, people she met along the way that really stayed with me, were two different families, both going through a grieving process, one with a very strong Caribbean Christian tradition, and another with no faith tradition whatsoever, but had opted to have a secular funeral. And the way they approached that grief, the way they were held in that grief by those different celebrants was very, as you would imagine, different. But there was a real commonality in the process, in the human experience of losing a loved one and what was needed to hold them at that time. And family and community and hope were things that were completely parallel across both of their experiences. So I think, I could go on forever about the different kinds of programs and how we're trying to respond to faith communities and people with different beliefs. But I think the one thing we can draw down on always is, what is our human experience? What are the big moments of life? Where are the challenges? Where are the difficulties? Where are the joys? What are the things we all share, regardless of our position? And then how can we bring programs that reflect perhaps different approaches to that will both reflect people who understand that faith tradition, but also perhaps introduce that to people who may not already know that faith tradition, but spot something in it that's useful for them. And just to create a commonality of shared experience.
That's really interesting. And can I just probe a bit more about generations, Nick? We were talking about it briefly before we came on stage. When I was preparing this, I noticed that there's a book coming out next year by the New Statesman writer Lamorna Ash. I forget what it's called, but it's looking at a new generation's search for religion. I think she travels around the country and interviews younger people who are in churches or have converted. What's your understanding from your experience, from the research that you've done about how this changes or doesn't according to generations?
It's really interesting, and I think that's part of the reason I asked Mike more about your experience with that intergenerational conversation. I think it's different when you're looking within faith traditions, and that's one place where the conversation feels markedly different from perhaps first, second generation to third generation, whatever faith you might be looking at. We did a program this year called the Bradford Aunties that was looking at a group of women in Bradford who are Muslim, and one strong part of that film was how Islam is married with a life in modern Britain, and what are the challenges, and where do the thing that really struck me about that film was the perception that perhaps first generation Muslims in Britain, certainly in that part of the world, have about the younger generations and vice versa. And by getting together and spending time together, actually they found that those preconceptions or perceptions, even stereotypes, weren't the case. And the important things to get together and have that conversation. When you're not talking about faith traditions, younger people, I think, are really looking for what you've hit on earlier, something definitive, something that's not the mushy middle, is that the phrase? Something that really you can grab hold of and have a reaction to or an experience with. We had an episode of Songs of Praise, and I know you wouldn't normally think that connects to a younger audience necessarily, but it's 63 years old this year. But a couple of years ago, there was the extraordinary story of a woman called Louise Blyde, who was interviewed about the experience of sitting by her husband's bedside as he was dying. And she talked about the experience of the Holy Spirit descending on them as a family for these crucial, last, very painful moments, and what that gave them. And that was taken out as a clip and put on the BBC homepage during our Faith and Hope season. And it just got the most extraordinary response, with something like 900,000 people clicking on it, from all different demographics, because it's an extraordinary story. And I think to Justin's point earlier about pointing towards something otherworldly, something maybe a bit weird, but nevertheless feels like a really genuine experience connected with people. So I think something that is requires a response is something we know will work with all audiences, but younger groups especially.
Mary, did you want to come in? Or?
I was just on the younger people wanting or needing or being open to something weird. I met a 22-year-old not long ago who sincerely is convinced that the world is flat. The Zoomers are much weirder, at least some, especially the very online ones, are much weirder than you could possibly imagine. So yeah, absolutely, leaning into the weird is the way forward. And the other, talking of the other interesting twist on the new younger converts coming into the church, particularly into the Orthodox Church, I believe this is true in America, although I don't know in the UK, is that they are preponderantly men. Yep. And this is a plot twist on everything which had been hitherto happening. I think the church has been steadily, well, certainly the Anglican Church has been steadily feminizing for a long time, to the point where it seemed as though it was perceived to be the case for a long time that it was just going to end up with no men going to church at all. And that has I wouldn't say it's completely reversed, but the trend has reversed significantly. And there's something very interesting going on there in terms of.
There is.
And what seems to be significant is that young men are craving a church which asks something of them. That doesn't just want them to feel good about themselves, but, enjoins them to discipline or to difficulty or to self-sacrifice or to challenge and ask something of them.
Really think, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, just continue on this theme of people being inspired by experiences of others. And very recently in Churches Together in England, we launched a fund basically just to fund young leaders 18 to 35 to go abroad and just have an experience that's ecumenical, that's about unity and the church. And then all we say is just come back and tell us about it. It's really interesting to watch a movement beginning to grow, but also to watch as other young leaders are inspired by the experience that that person has had by going abroad and spending time with a community. And actually to see how those young leaders are transformed by their experience. I really didn't think, I felt we needed to do something about, lowering the age of the rooms that we found ourselves in. I've been astonished actually at the positive impact that it's had in young leaders' lives.
This episode is brought to you by Starbucks. Smooth, bright, deliciously crafted. Introducing Starbucks Sansera Blend, their smoothest, brightest coffee yet. It's a new kind of light roast, one that's packed with so much flavor, it shines no matter how you brew it. So go ahead and try it hot, iced, black, or with a splash of creamer. Visit athome.starbucks.com/Sansera-blend-coffee to bring Starbucks Sansera Blend home.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
Learning through play starts with Lego Duplo. With Lego Duplo, toddlers can develop real-life skills while having fun with colorful bricks made just for them. Large, easy to grip, and safe to explore. When children express themselves with Lego Duplo, they build patience, problem-solving, and empathy. See your child learn perseverance and self-expression with everything they imagine and create. Visit lego.com/preschool to learn more.
Madeleine, did you want to come in there?
Just that I think the younger generation also highly prizes tolerance, not judging others. And so I wonder whether there will be a tension if we're saying that younger people are being drawn to more towards these ends that are very demanding, that are high, or I'm wondering if that is then going to create a tension with some of the views that they hold about inclusion, and whether that will actually clash with some of the teaching that they come across, because I do think that a very strong value for younger generations is tolerance.
And that was also gendered.
I was going to say the same. The interesting thing is the research that seems to be coming out now across lots of parts of the West and elsewhere is this disparity now between men and women, especially at that young age, in terms of their political direction. And you're getting, I'm sure you guys are aware of this, but young men veering more conservative, young men remaining or continuing to be more liberal and progressive. And I think this is very much tied to the new interest that exists across a lot of young men to re-engage with traditional faith. And what's interesting is just a couple of months ago, I think it was Pew Research came out with this new statistic, I think in the USA, that for the first time among Gen Z, there are more young men attending church than young women. And that, as you said, completely flips the norm on its head. And so I think a lot of that is coming from, especially for young men, is that there's a sort of male identity crisis in the West that's grown up in the last couple of decades. And a lot of these young men who are looking for something, as we said, solid to kind of make sense of their life and trying to find an identity that seems to be quite hard to pin down in the modern world, they're suddenly finding some of these more traditional, either in the Eastern Orthodox or traditional Catholic end of the spectrum, or sort of that challenging, demanding aspect of other, church traditions. It's suddenly quite compelling and interesting. But there is a tension there. Exactly when you say, Madeleine, that there's going to be a demographic that says, but can we make sense of this in our very tolerant, pluralistic world? And I think probably the tension is more between men and women than just generally
I would also say that, going back centuries, women have been more religious. They have been, Christianity was the religion of women and slaves. And so I was sort of pushed back against this idea about the feminization of the church, because I think that is a centuries-old phenomenon, that women are more religious, and for some very interesting reasons. I think, within the church, it's only 10 years that we've even enabled women to be bishops, or, men still far outnumber women who are in full-time positions. So I think I would just slightly push back on the idea that we have sort of feminized the church.
Yep. We've limited time. There's one issue I really did want to bring out, which, for want of a better phrase, is social action. People who have read Theos reports, of which there are many available tonight, and they're all free. Get the plug in there. We've done a lot of research over the years on the role of faith groups in general, church groups in particular, conducting Christian social action, Christian social liturgy, actually getting involved and engaging in community. And it's a kind of commonly used aphorism that we talk about, that people come into contact with the love of God through the love of the godly, and that people don't do these kind of things just for narrowly kind of evangelistic purposes. We're going to open a soup kitchen because we're going to get people into the kingdom, but it builds those relationships of grace and encouragement that people do find opens the door to them. Now, Mike, you've got a huge amount of experience on this. Can you give us your perspective on what role that has to play for the church in the future?
Yeah, I think firstly for the individual, if, for instance, you're serving in a food bank or a debt centre, or the warm welcome campaign that Church Works run, 4,000 churches opening their doors in the winter to help those who are struggling to put food on the table or to heat their homes. I think the thing is, everyone gets transformed. The person who experiences the love of the Christian community, experiences that love, and may want to say, well, why are you doing that? I can always remember when I was a street pastor in Birmingham between 2004 and 2008, the overwhelming kind of question people would say is, what are you doing in those silly uniforms at 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night? And what church are you from? And, it was just people were intrigued why we were there. But also the people who were doing the serving, they are also transformed as well. And actually, I think there has been some statistics to suggest that because of the work that churches have done around food bank and other mercy ministries, actually, particularly during the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, the church has gained a good reputation as responding to the practical needs that people and communities have. So I think it's a good news story, juxtaposed against some of the challenges that we've seen around safeguarding historically.
That's really interesting. Madeleine, we wrote our 2016 report on the future of the church, and one of the conclusions we came to was that numerically, and this wasn't just the Church of England, numerically it might be smaller, but it would be more activist. Is that a trend that you have noticed?
Yeah, so I thought that report was great, by the way, Hannah's report, but she sort of spoke about these two things happening in parallel. So we saw the actual decline in attendance and affiliation and people's relationship with the church as a worshiping community, with this huge surge in social action. I think one of the questions was, how do those two things relate to each other? And I remember there was a really interesting example in that report of somebody that was coming to the church. I think it was for a food bank, but it was some kind of social need. And they asked if the cross could be removed from the room because it bothered them. And that was a kind of realization for the church, hang on, how do we sort of tackle that? What was that person's understanding of where they had come to and what they had the right to ask of the church as a provider? So I think that question about how people understand the motivation for the church's social action and whether it actually, what are the results for the church? Not that you should only offer these social action if it results in growth. That would be entirely wrong. But I did think that was a sort of very interesting case study that maybe, is an important thing to delve into. I think at the Church Times as well, we've also looked at kind of a volunteer crisis in the Church of England. And I think there's this whole question of where are these people going to come from who are on the front line? If we have declining congregations, that inevitably will have an impact on who is there to keep the building open. I think there's a generation of women who've kind of been the backbone of a lot of the Church of England's social action who are not being replaced. People like me who work and have small children, I'm not really going to be sort of take the baton on from some of these sort of heroic older women who are doing all this civic action, keeping the community going. And I think you did another really good report that looked at sort of how perhaps some projects are just sort of one volunteer stepping down away from, can we keep this going? So I think there's some really critical questions there to ask about capacity.
Mary?
Just to say, there's also historically, this really speaks as well to your point about women and the church. There is a long-standing and really very ambivalent relationship between Christian social action and the welfare state, which is in several senses. Firstly, the moral intuitions which underpin the welfare state are fundamentally Christian. There's no way around that. People do welfare because it's a fundamentally Christian impulse. It emerges out of Christian culture. But also, structurally, the welfare state has its origins in 19th century women's social reform. This was bourgeois women of, the church ladies of the kind you're describing, Madeleine, who organized, who got together, who fundraised, and who were doing the welfare state avant la lettre. And it was the institutions that those ladies built, which were then nationalized. Some of them are still going. Mary Augusta Ward, a phenomenal social activist and a very amazing and a remarkable novelist, founded a children's centre not far from here, which is still going. I mean, an extraordinary number of the institutions that these ladies built have now just been sort of absorbed, but they've been nationalised. And then there's the question, where does that, has there been a sense, sometimes I wonder, has there been a sense since that we don't need to do that? We don't need to galvanise ourselves anymore because we just pay our taxes and they do it all for us. And, and I don't really know the answer, but I feel like although I doubt anybody in this room would cheer on demolishing the welfare state, and yet there's a very interesting relationship between those two sets of impulses, and I wonder sometimes about how they interact.
I'd just say my yeah, I was just following on from what you say. I mean, over the last sort of 25 years, the number of evangelical Pentecostal charismatic churches now involved in social action has hugely changed. I think one of the challenges is, are we in danger of clearing up the mess of government? So we almost become useless idiots. And that, I think, is a challenge. But what I am seeing with a lot of the social action organisations is that they really are digging now into issues of social justice. So the whole notion of, acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly with your God genuinely, I think is beginning to be lived out in the way those organisations are partnering with church.
I want to ask one more question before we go to the floor for questions, and then if I got the time at the end, I'm going to ask you a concluding question after we've had Renee from the floor. But it's about community as well, which has been in the background of our discussion. I'm really struck, you used the example of the Orthodox Church, Pentecostal, Charismatic Church, and migrant churches. So much of that is about belonging. It's about belonging to a wider group of people. And the research that we've done at Theos, and actually lots of people have done, loneliness is a real issue in our society. Going back to the origins of the welfare state, loneliness isn't mentioned in the Beveridge report. It's not an issue in the 1940s or so. And yet we know that the psychological and physical impact that loneliness has on people is really significant and seemingly growing. I wonder whether, and I'm going to give you first, Justin, and give anyone else a chance to jump in on this, whether simply being there as a group of people is a powerful statement in a society which is conspicuous for its individualism and its loneliness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's one of the key things that I lay out at the book is one of the key strengths of the church is that it is still about people getting together on a regular basis in a culture where that is increasingly rare, but in which I think people are still the same deep down. They crave human community and relationship. And we're now delivering it in all these sorts of ways in which it's being delivered on screens. I had my first experience when I was in San Francisco in the summer of a driverless taxi, and you can literally order it on the app. It pulls up at the curb, you get in, there's no one at the steering wheel, it just steers itself to your destination. And it was fun and novel, but also very scary, because it's like, okay, this is what we're doing with technology. We're creating the ability to live completely independently, never have to actually interact face to face with anybody. And I think as we continue to move in that direction in a digital age, I think it's inevitably, there's the kind of social breakdown that produces and the kind of mental health problems that accelerates. It's going to inevitably, I think, lead to people looking for a cure, looking for something that, and I think the only thing you can do that is genuine community. Yeah. And the church at its best is a community, that the kind of community people are looking for in what is actually still quite, as you said earlier, a religious, but in all the worst ways, culture. You know, there is cancel culture. There is a kind of censorious aspect to living in that digital world. And I think people are craving not just a community, but a community of grace, where we all say, actually, we're all in the same boat. We're all messed up. But we gather around someone who kind of has done something around it. So for me, I think this is actually an incredible opportunity for the church, as much as we're seeing a lot of the problems that are going on.
Just jumping off that, to your point, I remain very angry with all the Christian churches that accepted lockdown. I thought that was a terrible mistake.
They sorry, I didn't hear
that accepted lockdown.
They closed down the churches.
They closed the churches. Yeah. And also, furthermore, specifically for Christians who accepted Zoom church. You know, Christianity is an incarnational faith. You know, the idea that we could receive that Holy Communion could be something you could experience through a screen, to me is I don't want to use the word, but it's just not, it's not Christian.
Thank you. We're going to take some questions from the floor now, and I guess the lights will come up, because otherwise I will be literally unable to see any hands at all. If you could, that's wonderful, thank you. There will be a couple of rows of mics. We'll try and take two or three questions at a time. If you could tell us who you are, where you come from, if it's relevant, and if I could gently encourage you at this early stage of our question and answer to make sure they're questions, I'd be enormously grateful. So there is a lady there, gentleman there, and then a gentleman there. So, yeah, that's right. Gentleman there, a lady in front, and then a gentleman at the front, and then I'll come to you next.
Okay, my name's Jeremy Clare, a lay Christian from Oxfordshire. I wrote down before I came here, is this an organisational question or a spiritual question? And I've had my answer tonight. It's an organisational question. Basically, this has been a discussion about, to use Justin's phrase, religion as an institution and on the way in which it's organised. I find it incredible, you know, that in an evening devoted to Christianity, we've had one mention of God, one mention of the Bible, one mention, thanks to Daisy, of the Holy Spirit, not a single mention of Jesus Christ, who is the head of the church. I'd be grateful for some comment on that.
I'm sure we'll get some. Thank you very much. Lady in front of you, please.
Hi, my name's Anne. I'm from We Do Stories. Interestingly, ex-BBC, previously Mercy Ships and previously CAP. So I've kind of done the range of media and Christian impact. I think listening to the conversation, I would actually agree with the gentleman behind me. I didn't hear too much about the future having a church, but more just about the current state. But there is so much good social impact that comes from Christianity, always has done. But have we fallen into a place where the church currently maybe has taken the worst bits of culture as well as some of the best bits of Christian faith? So things like celebrity, cancel culture, etc. Is that actually rife through the church and our Christian media as much as it is in the world?
Thank you very much, Anne.
And gentleman at the front, please, George.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to have a participatory panel so that they have a say. And it'd be lovely if every one of you had a say. That would make the church wonderful.
Might make a long evening.
And this, my book is From Heaven to Heaven. If you don't have a vision, you die. So Adam and Eve in heaven.
That's a wonderful, like, could you come to the
question. What is your vision for the church? And how are you going to live it out? I've spent 7 years at Centrepoint, 10 years running a drop-in center. I say, get on the front line and we'll solve every problem.
Thank you. Your name, sir?
Alan Ray.
Alan. Thank you very much. So we've got some very good, slightly spiky questions there from Jeremy and Alan. I'm going to go down the panel this way, actually, this line, and so you know the questions coming to you. Justin, I'm allowed to pick up any of those questions. I guess I might have to answer the first one at some point if you don't. But
well, I receive Alan's rebuke, which is that we haven't really mentioned the spiritual sort of diagnosis really here. And forgive me if that wasn't clear, but for me, it absolutely, as a Christian, does come down to the question of whether there is a God and whether that God has made himself known to us. And for me, the reason why I do believe the future has a church is precisely because of that, actually. Regardless of what the statistics tell us, one way or the other, as a Christian, I do believe that the future is the church, because that is Christ's body on earth. And sort of, in a sense, from a faith point of view, I have no doubt that the future has a church, and that ultimately the answer to all the questions will be Jesus. I think it still behoves us to nevertheless look at what's happening in the culture and how the way that we organize ourselves institutionally helps or hinders people actually receiving that. And I think there are just some things happening in the culture right now where we do need to ask ourselves, are we answering the right kinds of questions that people are asking? Are our churches fit to allow for this new generation who I think are actually searching for these spiritual answers to find a home and find a place? So that would be my only comeback there, is that, yeah, absolutely, for me, Jesus is central to it all.
Madeleine?
So I think, the first question fits into sort of an argument that we can fall into a very secular framework when we talk about church growth and the future of the church. There's a really good Lutheran theologian in the States who I really like called Andrew Root, and he critiques the church precisely for this, saying that you're only using sociological tools to analyse this, and actually they leave no room for divine action. That's something I'm quite conscious about at Church Times, because you are met with graphs and statistics and interviews and polling, and they really leave no space for divine action. And I think Andrew Root's argument is actually we need to be less sort of frenetically, as you said, managing, writing strategies, crunching statistics. We should be praying and asking what it is God is telling us in this moment. And I think, as the gentleman has identified, it's a trap that we can fall into, where we attempt to use sociological tools to map out where we're going.
Thank you. Mary, I guess, would you mind picking up Anne's question about whether the church picks up the worst bits of culture, whether it's got celebrities or cancel culture and that kind of thing?
I was actually going to answer both of the other. Or rather, speak to both of those inquiries. But yeah, I don't know. I have something to say about cancel culture as well. My thing, I think it's you're right to say, can we not spend our time, navel gazing about organizational structure, because this is what I was saying about the boring ones in the middle and the ones that make people feel things. My feeling, in response to the question, does the future have a church? Yes, but I think political Christianity is probably toast. And I think that's probably a good thing.
So what Christianity is toast?
Political Christianity, institutional, respectable, institutional, middle of the road, spreadsheet wielding, PowerPoint mongering Christianity is probably toast. And I for one will not mourn it. I think the fire is rising, I really do. And I think it's coming up, it's bubbling up in unexpected places, and people are encountering the divine in unexpected ways. And they're finding ways to see the spirit world directly again, and to perceive that all of that is real. And it is right there. You just have to open your eyes. People see it. Yeah, absolutely they see it. And that will either, that doesn't always take a Christian flavor, which I suppose is probably why I've kind of sidled around the theological questions. Also, I'm just not a theologian. But I think it's, coming to God, coming to the Christian God is only one of the paths that can take. And there are plenty of others. And I'm not fuzzy and tolerant about that. I think some of those paths go in quite dark directions. And we should take that very seriously. But that kind of an awakening is a serious one. That's not just about, growing, that's not just about bums on seats, that's about people just perceiving the world very differently. The last time people, there was a major consciousness shift on that level. We ended up with the 30 Years' War, which was a mess. And I very seriously think we're on the threshold of something of that scale. I may be wrong on the timeline. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think it will happen in my lifetime. And I think we absolutely think we should take that seriously, and very much more seriously than PowerPoint mongering. So I think we should be Christians. We should lean into that as Christians, and not just say, it's fine, whatever you believe.
Mike. As a Pentecostal, I'm interested in the first question. And is the last thing I said was that scripture, Micah 6:8, acting justly, loving mercy, walking humbly with your God, acting justly, dealing with systemic sin, loving mercy, dealing with sin in the community, and particularly the whole issue of who is my neighbour, walking humbly with God, our personal walk with Jesus, and dealing with our own personal sin as well. That's the gospel. I think one of the issues in Western society is that we tend to kind of differentiate between the kind of believing and the doing. But I want to say, from a global South perspective, it's just all in one. I go to a small church plant and in Warsaw, in quite a needy community. Its main outreach is actually working with people who've got immigration issues, and we just open the church doors. We give people the immigration advice. We serve them perhaps some Jamaican Saturday soup. Lo and behold, they feel so welcomed that we find them coming to church on a Sunday. And that church was only opened just over a year ago, and it is growing already. It's one whole, I think, but when we kind of say, well, that's social action and that's the gospel, I think that's a Western thing. We are love, we demonstrate it, we speak it, and that's been authentic. Thank you, Mike. Daisy?
I think that was evidenced by what Madeleine said, actually, with your comments about the women, the unsung women who are holding communities and churches together. That for me would be a perfect example of God's love, of Christian principle in action. And to your point, was it Anne? Does the church speak to the best and the worst? I say this is a great example of the very best, but of course, how can it not speak to the worst? Because what is the church? It's made up of the people who attend it, who support it, who run it, the millions of people who don't have their stories told. So how could that not reflect the whole breadth of humanity as well? And when that is the worst and not the best, which is the context and the climate that we've come together tonight in, what can we do? What can I do? Certainly I'll think about from the side, of media that I can speak to. And I think that's what you said at the very beginning. How do we tell a better story of faith? How do we connect people through their experiences, their lived experiences of faith? How can that be evidenced as a resource in people's lives, whether or not they themselves have had that experience? And can that lead us to a more empathic and generous way of coming to the conversation? So we're not othering one another, but we are trying to understand one another.
Thank you. And two really beautiful answers. Right, we've got time for 3 more questions. We're going to go to this side of the room. So there's a gentleman right at the back.
I'm Bernard Hips from the Bruderhof. It'd be interesting to know from the panel if the future has a church, whether or not that church might look a bit more like an intentional community, and how intentional communities could be used as a preservation for society, as they have done in the past, and a more radical expression of faith.
Thank you. Radical expression. Thank you very much, Bernard. Eddie, yes. At the front here. And then lady there. Yeah.
Thanks. Eddie Talesbich. I was very struck by what people were saying about experience and sensation and feeling. Pope Benedict, I think as a sort of trying to get into the new atheism, he said that religion was made up of faith, and I take that as being the sensation, the experience, but it was also made up of reason. So where is the reason in the church going forward if it's all now about the experience economy?
Thank you very much. And lady at the front here, I think. Yeah.
Hi, I'd just like to ask a question about how important do you feel the place of evangelism is in the church, and whether that will help it as a future?
Thank you very much. Your name, madam?
Agneta Oyewale.
Agneta, thank you very much. I'm going to go the other way down the panel, please, as my pen fails. Daisy.
Well, hello from the Bruderhof. Very nice to see you. We made a film with the Bruderhof community in 2019. They were very kind enough to grant access, unprecedented access, to the BBC to film a documentary, which continued to be one of the best rated programmes that we've had in the last 5 years. And I think precisely for the reason that is embedded within your question, community and an intentional way of living. I think something about that really struck people as a way of life that looks very appealing. There are many things that the community offers that I think answer some of the problems we've talked about tonight: loneliness, care for the elderly, community, family, all of those things which perhaps are what people are lacking. So I think there is something in that. And I think when we do make programs about community, there is something that taps into audiences and we see them coming to it. On the reason versus experience point, I'm interested in why you feel the two are separate, and would just like to ask you to expand a little bit on why it's an either or.
Can we pause that just for the sake of getting through?
Oh, sorry.
He's going to be around later, so we'll make sure you pin him against the wall and that's...
And then evangelism, does it have a place? I suppose, again, I'd ask you, what do you mean by evangelism? Of course, if we're talking about spreading information, spreading the word, spreading love, talking to people, of course, that has to be, otherwise, where is that conversation going to come from?
Can I verify what I mean by evangelism? By evangelism...
The mic's coming to you there.
By evangelism, I mean giving everybody, Jew, Gentile, Muslim, Hindu, unbelievers, the opportunity to hear the good news of Jesus dying on the cross to take away their sins, rising again, and giving them an opportunity to bow the knee to the lordship of Jesus.
Thank you very much. I'm really clear.
Okay. Yeah. Mike, do you want to? Yeah, no, happy to. So firstly, to answer the first question, I've visited the Bruderhof community a number of times and always been inspired. I think one of the reasons why it works is because it's outward facing. And I think intentional communities that are outward facing are going to attract people. Coming to the issue of evangelism, I think what we have is sometimes is what you might describe as a crisis of confidence. I think people need to be confident in sharing their faith. And I think particularly many of us are perhaps working in public life. And I would just say this, when I walk into a room, I don't want to leave my faith at the door. I go in as a whole person. I speak as a Christian, of course, as a Christian leader, but I refuse to leave a part of me at the door. I think it's important that we bring our whole self to the public square and we witness without embarrassment to the Lordship of Jesus Christ.
Mary.
Oh, yes. I too am a Bruderhof fan. I've visited your community. I love your work. I would also say about it, it's a serious undertaking. It's a set of vows that you make to one another. And I think people, I know a great many people who look at you guys from the outside and think, wow, that looks amazing, but also that's not for me. Which is not, it's in no way I find, to my eye, as an outsider, having visited your communities, you're keeping something alive which revealed preference, actually, in most of the rest of the world most of the rest of England certainly suggests we really struggle with, about being available for one another, being willing to be bound by one another, and being willing to make the sacrifices which make community a thing and a reality, and to be bound by that within a faith community, which is such a fundamentally central part to making something like that work. However, anecdotally, I know several circles of mostly young parents who are sort of in the London periphery, or they know one another, and who are trying to find ways of organizing to move house together, as it were, to create little knots of families so that they can support one another in what feels sometimes like quite a hostile and culturally unwelcoming modern England. And finally, just on the question of evangelism, I agree with Mike. It really is just a matter of just being not embarrassed. It would have been unthinkable when I was 20 for a normal, averagely socially adjusted, reasonably attractive young person to wear a cross around their neck and be openly a Christian. That's not the case anymore. The trend has gone in the other direction. But what's really remarkable about the younger people who do that is they're just not embarrassed. They're entirely matter of fact about it. They pray before meals. Some of them are just completely matter of fact about the fact that they don't want to have sex before marriage. And it's not a big thing, and it's not a thing. They're just embarrassed, and that has an extraordinary power to it, and it has an evangelical power to it. On the question of reason, I guess the only thing what popped into my head as you asked the question was, we have 2,000 years of theology. There's a lot of books. We're not going to stop reading just because we want to feel something as well. I think we were right.
Madeleine.
I like the second question, because I do think there has been a move to saying, practice the faith first, go to church, experience church, belief can follow. But I do think for some people, their questions about, is this true, they matter, and that is a stumbling block to them entering into practice. And I just think that remains true for some people. They need to have their questions answered. And I was going to say Mary's point that actually, there's an enormous amount of intellectual firepower in the Christian faith, and perhaps we're not very good at enabling people to access that. So yes, within church circles, we might read theology, but I think there might be people who are very surprised by the richness of Christianity's philosophical tradition. And so I like that question, because I think we don't want to sell people short and not enable them to access all of that thought, because I think it's incredibly impressive.
Okay. Yeah, the question of reason was also one I wanted to focus on, because, as I said earlier, a lot of my early career was all about providing reasons through apologetics and so on. And I think there's absolutely a place for that. I think what I've increasingly come to realize, though, is that's not where most people begin. And they begin with the experience that they have of their own life and the imagination. And I think Blaise Pascal put it very well in the 16th century when he said, make good people wish that Christianity were true, then show them that it is. And I think that's the order we need to take it today. We start with people's imagination, the way they wish the world was. And once we've helped them to see that perhaps Christianity has something to say to that, then we can move into that sort of questions about, well, is the Bible true? Does God exist? And so on. But I don't think they're going to be too interested in those technical questions, if you like, until you've given them a reason to wish that it were true. And I think, that ties into the evangelism and community question, because for me, historically, those monastic communities, that they inevitably were only a very small subsection of the population who devoted themselves to that kind of life, but they had an outsized impact on the culture that they were part of. And I think that could be true again when we see people devoting themselves to sort of that kind of intentional community. That can be a real powerhouse, actually, as a form of witness to the wider community about what Christianity means and how it can exist in the world. And I just love the absolutely clear encapsulation of the gospel that we heard in the final question, because I think there is something about just not overcomplicating things sometimes. And it reminded me of an experience I had a week or two ago. I was at dinner when it just so happened, of the 5 or 6 of us around the table, 5 of us around the table, 4 of us were Christians and 1 was not. And we ended up having a long conversation with this person, this young guy in his early 20s, who was not a Christian but very interested. And, and I was sort of playing the very kind of, well, let's just take this very gently. And I was saying, well, you could, try out a church, and you could, go on an Alpha course. And there's lots of ways to explore faith. And the guy next to me, who's basically a Pentecostal, said, or you could just play the sinner's prayer right now and we'll get it done. and I was like, okay, maybe actually there's a time and a place for actually just being a bit more direct and saying, okay. So for me, inevitably it's going to be something of a mixture of that. But I do feel like this openness that I'm seeing is actually, it's not as, we sometimes overcomplicate it, and people are actually looking for something to make sense of their life. And I think the time's coming when the Christian story, it might just be the thing that does it.
Thank you. One of the joys of being a chair in an event like this is you get brilliant comments like that, really perceptive questions from the audience. One of the frustrations is you sit here thinking, okay, how am I going to answer? How would I answer that? And then you prevent yourself from doing so. I'm not going to answer those questions, but I will sum up. And in summing up, I think try and answer, in a sense, Jeremy's question, which I think fairly was directed at me rather than the panel. I suppose it's partly because, I've got on my discussion guide, we've got questions about safeguarding and disestablishment here. It could have got a lot more institutional than it was. And I don't think it did, because we talked about people experiencing, people searching for meaning, people looking for ideas that are morally demanding, that ask something of them, people actively loving their neighbours in practical ways up and down the country, and people drawing on a really significant and deep philosophical tradition without necessarily being constricted by that tradition. Now, those to me they're not institutional answers, they're deep cultural answers. And I also point towards a fact that we always come back to at Theos, is that we speak into a plural public square where Christian ideas and language are deeply unfamiliar. Now, sometimes the way you deal with that is you lean into the weird and you say something which is directly challenging. But I also think, and I guess partly because my kids are this age, they're late teenagers, early 20s now, without the accompanying integrity of a life and the integrity of a community, you almost don't have the right to speak in those situations, and you certainly won't be heard. So whereas all those things are valuable, without the life that is lived in faith and trust and grace and obedience, all those words, I think, do tend to fall on stony ground a little bit.
Thank you for listening to today's edition of the Surprising Rebirth podcast, and thanks to Theos for permission to rebroadcast this live event. You can find a link to their great work with the show notes, of course, and I wonder what you thought of the discussion. Do feel free to email me your thoughts, feedback@think.faith. If you enjoyed today's show, why not share it with others on your social media, or post a rating and a review on your podcast provider? It does help others to discover the show. And thanks to Zoroastrial for leaving a rating and a review saying, "Fabulous mix of pragmatic, thoughtful and spiritual. I'm drinking it up like a cool drink of water on a hot, dry day." Finally, if you can support the show, makes a huge difference to my little production company, Think Faith, being able to make this podcast and bring you more shows. Silver supporters get early access and exclusive bonus content too. In fact, right now you can watch my full conversation with Sharon Dirks on Am I Just My Brain? That's only available to supporters. Oh, and gold supporters also get books signed by me and the chance for a monthly catch-up too. The links to support are with today's show. Coming up next time.
It's now okay in mainstream popular culture to unapologetically engage religion in your art. From my seat as a curator and kind of a critic writing about music, it's really interesting when I find that in secular pop culture where there's kind of this interest, this resurgence of Christianity as a source of meaning and poetry and inspiration. It's really cool, and I think that it's probably another expression of this vibe shift that we're talking about.
The rebirth in music. Find out why God is back in the charts and some incredible stories of the way rock stars, rap artists, and musicians across the board are returning to faith-fueled lyrics and melodies in their music. And don't forget, that documentary episode is available to download and listen to right now, a whole 2 weeks early, when you become a supporter. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and the Jerusalem Trust, editing by Isaac Simmons. Check out our YouTube channel too, where you can find today's show on video, plus loads more. Thanks for being with me. See you next time.
So good, so good, so good.
Great brands, great prices. Everyone's got a reason to rack.
You know they have Marc Jacobs?
Nike? Yes. Just so many good brands. Vince, Birkenstock, and more brands you love are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
At the UPS Store, we want to make this summer the summer of shipping. Summer Shipalooza. So you can start crossing items off your must-ship list. Like the vintage film camera your college kid needs for class. Or the vase you told your mom you would send her ages ago. And with our pack and ship guarantee, your items arrive safe or we reimburse you. So stop by your local store today for everything you need to be unstoppable. Visit the upsstore.com/guarantee for full details. Available at participating locations. Most locations are independently owned. Product, services, pricing, and hours of operation may vary. See Center for details. The UPS Store. Be unstoppable.
Don't be left in the dark. Find out about our latest shows, upcoming events, and recent articles by subscribing to my Think Faith newsletter. It'll arrive once a fortnight, and I'll even send you the first chapters of both my books, Why I'm Still a Christian and The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, for free when you sign up. And if you want to support this show, you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content when you become a silver supporter. Gold level supporters also get signed copies of both those books and the chance for a monthly catch up with me. Your support makes a huge difference. The links for the newsletter or to support are with the show info, or go to justinbrierley.com.